Content episode 171. Theatre artist, writer, educator, and activist, Kimberly Skye Richards.
For me, that's one of the roles that artists play within the polycrisis, is supporting us through processes of unnumbing. Sometimes we might describe it as like reattuning of senses, the kind of listening, right, exercises and sound exercises that you offer would be part of that, right? And all of that too is about undermining the ways that we are taught mastery, to master ourselves, to not show emotions, to kind of disconnect our heads from our bodies so that we work more efficiently within the capitalist paradigm.
I first met Kimberly Skye Richards, also known as Kim Richards, while doing a Conscient podcast soundwalk on November 1st, 2021 in Trout Lake Park in Vancouver.
Conscient Podcast, episode 76. I'm back in Trout Lake Park, and this time with Kim Richards. Hello, Kim.
Hello. So good to be here.
Well, we're going to do a sound walk like I did with Anjali about 6 months ago, so it's fun to go over some of the same terrain. So I just read a couple of articles of yours, and we just met, but I know you're interested in scale, and you're writing a lot about the issue of theatre and climate. But before you
I invite you to listen to episode 76, Seeding a Green New Theatre in Canada. Kim and I talked about the role of theatre in the climate emergency, and in particular, what kind of plays that already exist in Canadian theatre history are about environmental issues. This intrigued me then and still does today. We tend to have short memories, and yet art tends to have a very long tail. Now, I got to know and appreciate Kim when we were both members of the Mission Circle of Scale, the sectoral climate arts leadership for the emergency organization here in Canada. We also have regular exchanges about education and learning, such as the Facing Human Wrongs course that we both took as part of a cohort of artists in 2022.
You know, one of the many important teachings within GTDF's work that's, about this like intention to try to learn the lessons that we can learn from like what is currently dying, and apply those, like actually learn them so that we don't just continuously repeat these mistakes.
Now, during this second Conscient conversation in Kim's apartment in Vancouver, we focused on climate arts education and the recent launching of the Department of Utopian Arts and Letters, of which Kim is the librarian. It's a series of free courses and lots of fun. I recommend them. We also talked about the importance of self-care for activists and artists, and how the arts contribute to healing and resilience.
Like one of the most important roles for the arts in climate work for me right now is also just creating the time to develop, to maintain, to begin practices.
At the end of the episode, I practiced saying thank you to my guests with a gentle uptone of emotional gratitude, like I hear regularly on the New York Times, The Daily Podcast.
Hey, Kim, thank you very much.
Oh, well, hey, Claude. Thank you very much.
Hey, Kim, welcome back.
Hi, Claude. Great to be back.
There's so much we can talk about because we've been involved in some of the same projects in the art and climate. Let's call it a movement in Canada. But let me just reposition ourselves. On November 1st, 2021, we went for a sound walk, and we had just met. Mm-hmm. And I encourage people to listen to episode 76. I just listened to it on my way here on my bike in Vancouver, and I was so pleased that we did a sound walk, because I don't think you had have done one before.
No, I definitely hadn't.
We had a lot of fun, and we talked about the things you were doing at the time, which is around green practices in theater, and we're not going to go over that again, because you talked about it, and it's an unfolding story, how the arts community engages with the climate emergency and all the barriers and all that. But here we are in 2024, and a lot has happened, including a project that I heard about back in the early days of Scale, and I want to talk about that and about education, because you're an educator in many ways. And there's too much to talk about, but let's start with you. How would you present yourself today, your background, that kind of thing, and what's on your mind?
That's a great question. So I feel like I continue to work across academia, art space, and tap into or informed by activist work, movement kind of work. And predominantly, my day job is teaching at UBC writing studies, but I also find occasions to do other kinds of more creative educational work, both within that institution and outside of it. And so one of the ways that I've moved into that more expanded kind of educational work is through conversations and collaborations that emerged from being invited by you to Scale's mission circle at that early stage. And at that time, Scale had a few working groups, and Ian Garrett at York University and at the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts were invited to take over guiding the education working group. And so we took that on and had a number of meetings with interested parties in maybe the fall of 2021, early 2022, if that might be the right timeline. Thinking really broadly about education in relation to climate art in this country, and that meant thinking at a number of levels. So within existing institutions and the kind of training that practitioners would need in order to potentially green practices, but also embed more ecological kind of thought into their work. It also meant thinking about the kind of education that artists and creative people could offer more broadly to the public. And that's kind of where the majority of my work has come out in the last few years, including a project that is a collaboration with Ian called the Department of Utopian Arts and Letters.
Well, I think people should know what Scale is, just in case they don't know. It's Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency, and it's a group that was started by a number of artists and activists here in Vancouver, the Climate Emergency Unit that Seth Klein and others set up, and Angelia Pederai and Anthony Garofalo-Sauget and a bunch of us started this in the spring of 2021 to... and it goes on. It's now run by Annette Hagel, who lives in Ottawa. And it's like a coalition of people interested in creating more activity around art and climate, not just creating art about climate, but mobilizing the arts and cultural sector. And you and I, when we were on the mission circle, talked about how to do that. And c'est pas facile. How do you mobilize a community that's already struggling economically and yet are faced by the challenges that we know about and are saturated by certain things and yet have incredible potential to contribute to these complex issues by the nature of their work, by the nature of art, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what scale is. So when you talk about that, and so Kim, I would like to know more about the Department of Utopian Arts and Letters, in part because in a recent episode with Anita Fezic, she talked about her work with peasant futurisms. So tell me about that, because I know people can get involved, like it's an online project, and I've started, watching some of the videos, but that's a real thing that's going on right now that people have access to. So tell us a little bit how it came about, but mostly what it is and how people can get involved.
So the Department of Utopian Arts and Letters is a project that was born out of those conversations we were having at scale across artists, culture organizers, and environmental and climate justice activists like Anjali. So the project is born out of a recognition that the institutions that are currently in charge of managing the crisis and are not preparing us for the crisis. And so we are playing with this idea of a department. We're authorizing ourselves to become a department, be it, an academic department or a kind of, government
a ministry.
A ministry, right? The ministries that are playful as well. And because there's some power in that. And within that department, we hire artists as educators because they can offer us valuable skills, valuable insights, valuable resources in order to help us prepare for the unfolding crises, but also develop the kind of imaginative capacities to think about alternatives to the dominant narratives that we're saturated with in most media. And so more concretely, within the department, we hire artists to create a course, and that course begins with an orienting video, something in between a master class and the first day of class kind of video that gives an introduction to who they are, their positioning, where these ideas emerge from, and what you need to know in order to work through the course.
And a bit of a warning of what it is.
That's right.
Are you ready for this?
And then there's a syllabi that they create and that I help, do the kind of editorial work to support, that offers, in some cases, a kind of vision of the future to work towards, so such as in Sunita's course on peasant futurisms and imagining what that is, what that movement is, what that future could be, and that within that syllabus, it's intended for a kind of autodidactic learning, so you're able to work through it in your own way, in your own time, and it's broken into different kind of lessons that have some amount of guidance in writing and also resources, sometimes exercises, journaling exercises, dictionary exercises, activities to go out and do, conversations to have with a neighbor, like invitations to learn very particular things about the community and the place that you're living in. And it builds across the number of, lessons, and then there's some kind of final assignment, and of course everything is optional. All of these courses are free. They are driven by users. There's no structures in place in the department to have like a class per se. That's something I might think about as another iteration down the road, but they're really quite remarkable in offering visions of the future or offering different kinds of relational skills that are just not going to be offered within other kinds of educational spaces. So certainly Sunita's Peasant Futurisms class was the first one that we launched, and it's really powerful. It's done in a way that could be embedded within other spaces. So I taught a course this fall, an upper division theater course at UBC this fall, and I embedded it in my curriculum so that we could also work through that together and engage with those resources. But it also stand alone and can be a kind of community learning project.
Well, I took a look at the second one around crip culture, and what's it called again?
Crip Glam.
Crip Glam. And
Crip Glam, everyday spells for disability activism.
And it's a lot of fun, and it uses some very provocative and I find engaging language. Right? Let's jump into the artists and those educators, and it interests me in particular because I don't hear a lot about disability practices, culture, arts in my conversations about climate. I mean, it's there, but I think it's important to give voice to those who are working and have been for a long time, whether they're working specifically on climate emergency or related issues, climate justice, those kinds of things. I was happy to see those topics and those approaches come into the curriculum, so to speak. The fact that it's free, the fact that it's part of a larger project of what Ian is doing with his center. There's momentum there of being curious, of being invited. And this is something a woman named Louise Adongo, I had a conversation with her recently. So it's not a question of forcing or, it's a question of inviting. How can we invite people to engage with content?
Less wanting to convert or convince people to respond to the reality of our state than figuring out how to create invitations for people to come to it for themselves.
So it's early days, but how is it going? Are people engaging? Or I guess we'll talk later when it's more advanced, but are people excited by it the way I am?
I think so. Certainly part of my forthcoming work will be on getting the word out that it exists. And for me, that's actually also going to be an invitation to reconnect with the network that we were creating at scale, because those are interested partners, and of kind of thinking very creatively about how to share projects like this across different kinds of spaces and different kinds of art practices too. But yeah, so the project is hosted within a space called Mighty Networks that is sometimes used for other kind of open education content. And so it's available, and we're still learning about how people find it. Certainly through the CSBA channels helps, but we're also thinking thoughtfully about who would be particular communities of users who would be interested in each of these courses individually, and then how those might cross-pollinate as well. But it's growing all the time. I get little notifications when new people come to the project, and it's really exciting to see that. And also from the kind of early pilot that I did in my class, my students were really deeply impacted by the work, in part because it's so rooted within a real critique of the systems that we're currently living in and the ways that they disserve us, but that it doesn't stay stuck within that space of critique, but instead opens up all kinds of possibilities and very tangible kinds of practices, both within peasant futurisms and within Crip Glam, for making the worlds we want to work towards. So, for example, one of the resources in Julia Havard's class, which is the one on Crip Glam, is about, it talks about the importance of nightlife within queer community, but also then gives you resources to help do an accessibility audit of nightlife spaces to try to make those more accessible, right? So interweaving these different kinds of teachings and also giving you the tools you need in order to help make those kind of spaces more accessible for more people. So it's there's a lot of very practical kinds of things within it, even though it's actually framed as this utopian kind of project. And so, that's, I think, part of what's fun and exciting about it as well.
Well, we'll revisit it down the road. Of course, you and I have done some of the same courses, the Facing Human Wrongs course that is now out of UBC. It's not out of UVic, and used to be part of UBC, and that Vanessa Andreotti and the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective. And I'm finding there are increasing number, a lot of them in English, for, I think, reasons of international accessibility. I'm recently involved in the Deep Adaptation Forum, which is another place for people to engage, converse, speak their mind, learn, listen, cry, laugh, all of these emotions that we need to work through so that we can better face the realities that we have in front of us, I want to talk a bit about the role of art, because I just keep coming back to it, right? And it's evolved over time, and I'm happy that I'm not as dogmatic maybe as I was in the first years, because I was such a believer that the art can change the world, and it can, and we know it does. But now I'm starting to see that we don't necessarily need more art about climate that is sort of didactic, even though there's a place for that in a protest. It's nice to have a song or an anthem. But where do you see, I guess my statement is that I think we're in a lull right now. The momentum that was started in 2019 before the pandemic with the protests and climate action kind of got stunted by overtaken by the pandemic, and now we're recovering from the pandemic. The art sector is struggling, but it's finding ways. But we don't have momentum right now on climate. We have a lot of interest, we have a lot of caring, but we don't see that. So where are we at?
I mean, the movement right now has to be about addressing the enduring impacts of colonialism and imperialism, right? That's why our campuses have encampments, Free Palestine. Last night I was at an event with a number of the leaders of the Wet'suwet'en movement who are in town for the airing of their Doxa documentary, Yinta. And so I think it's the interstitching of the fights against colonialism and its enduring impacts that is always where the work has to be. And so, yes, climate isn't the face of that, but it is always, the legacy and the repercussions of those kinds of activities.
In a way, it's addressing the source or the causes, or whatever, however you want to describe that. But it's hard to go there, right? Because it's sort of biting the hand that feeds you to a certain extent. A lot of the colonial systems we rely on, Canada Council and others, to make a living. It's UBC, zero employment, and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's good to be open about what we're trying to do as a society, which is to evolve, which is to change, which is to adapt to the reality of the fact that we're killing ourselves as a species, right? And art, being a kind of a universal expression of humanness, plays such an important role, I find, and I can feel it. This is the thing, and I've been working with Shannon Litzenberger and others on workshops around dance and body dance. And when you start doing art, not just seeing art, but doing art, and then knowing that it changes, even listening to stories, I find can be transformative, because the knowledge of the story enters your mind, and then it takes a year or two before it manifests itself. But these things are very powerful. So I'm always thinking about how, in systems change, I talk a lot with systems innovators, right? And they're so wonderful, and they're so happy to have artists be part of it. So how can artists play a larger role while still making a living, while still denouncing, institutions that need to change? It's kind of complicated.
Part of what was feeling, what was coming up for me when you were speaking there was about the importance of practice. The practice is that we need that to help sustain us through these struggles, through these times. And it has to be embodied. It has to be, we have to find those ways of connecting to our whole selves, even while we're working within other institutions or in other ways that we're not asked to show up in with our whole selves. And so I'm finding like one of the most important roles for the arts in climate work for me right now is also just creating the time to develop, to maintain, to begin practices that are maybe somatic practices, that are movement practices. Other people might be more into sound practices or writing practices or whatever that may be. But and this is where I'm excited that you're going to be talking with Kelly McInnes, because I've been doing some practice with her, and that's around movement, so not performance, but around movement. And she offered a course called Dancing Our Nature that was really a beautiful invitation, and that, you know, helped me ground myself so that I could also do this other kind of work. And so, you know, how to move from that to the big questions that you're asking are really hard, because it doesn't mean that artists are not being paid for what it is that they're contributing, but certainly, you know, I'm finding like that is what I really need in order to continue to do the work. And when I'm not maintaining those kind of practices that are supported by other artists in the community, then I'm going to be struggling when I'm trying to do the other kind of educational work or other kind of, you know, activism.
Well, self-care. I know in some communities that when you're in the front line and you're tired, you move back and others step up. And that's expected, that you will get tired and need a rest, as opposed to always being. So I think this needs to be talked about. We need to share practices of, it's like a labor practice in activism. There are ways to nurture and still be in the front line when you can, and then nurture others to do it. I'm not an expert in that, but I'm, you know, I'm a learning learner in the sense that I'm learning about learning, education, and I learn and I unlearn. And the unlearn thing's quite real. Like I can feel the absence of certain ways that give a bit of space in my whatever to do.
Yeah. And I would also say that part of what I think some of the courses within the Department of Utopian Arts and Letters do, and these are a couple of courses that we haven't yet released, but we'll be doing so soon, is that they also like really invite people who don't necessarily consider themselves to be artists or practitioners, or who might be very detached from those kinds of things that we all did as children, you know, singing and dancing and drawing, and really like invites us back into that space, which is really necessary healing, I think. So I think that that's also something that course, some of those courses do, that's a really important contribution.
Well, we've covered the department because I was so happy to see it. I know it got funding from the council and other, and it was nice. It's nice to see something be accessible to everyone. There's no financial barrier, and it's volunteer, and it's going to be I assume a work in progress, right? Because inevitably you will learn I don't know if you'll adjust the curriculum, but as you add new modules, that it's an exciting iterative process, right? You get feedback, and I just did a course called Alchemize.
I'm starting it in this next season.
Oh, good for you. Well, I just was exchanging with Kamea Shane yesterday about, she's using a quote of mine from my experience, and I didn't intend it to be public, right? Because you write, and I was talking about how I'm going to cry now. my sounding modernity project essentially failed, and how failure is a big part of living and art making. Because you aim high as an artist, you try to do something, and then you just can't do it fully. And then you see your attempts that are pretty good, and some are better than others. But this idea of being vulnerable, I find really important, especially for men who are often hold back their emotions out of some kind of pride or whatever it's called. And just to be really, really vulnerable, and then accepting of yourself and of others. So Alchemize helped me with that, because it's 40 courses, and we did a whole episode about it. And there are other courses, but I like to experience them. I like to talk about them, because it's an invitation. Now, Alchemize costs some money because it's a fundraiser for the Green Dreamer podcast, which I think is perfectly fine when you're upfront about it. You say, we need to survive as an organization. This is a way that we're raising funds, and it's a sliding scale. It's really well done. But what are your thoughts about that? The idea of being vulnerable and just being more not authentic, but just putting yourself out there, with your experiences.
I love it. It feels like we become more human, right, when we're vulnerable. And I think that's part of, at the same time, the unlearning, and I think I really started using that word and noticing that through the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures work, like when I started to read Vanessa Andreotti and others in that group. The other one that I talk about a lot or think a lot about is processes of unnumbing, in relation often to the denials that we hold because of the magnitude of the crisis that we're facing and our complicities within it. And so being vulnerable, showing up with more of ourselves is absolutely part of that unnumbing, and it's hard work, and it's uncomfortable work, and it can feel so messy. But I think that for me, that's one of the roles that artists play within the polycrisis, is supporting us through processes of unnumbing. Sometimes we might describe it as like reattuning of senses, the kind of listening, right, exercises and sound exercises that you offer would be part of that, right? And all of that too is about undermining the ways that we are taught mastery, to master ourselves, to not show emotions, to kind of disconnect our heads from our bodies so that we work more efficiently within the capitalist paradigm. And so I think that in all the ways that we can resist that and try to dislodge the ways that it's become sediment in our bodies is incredibly valuable.
I did an interview with Jimmy Ong, who talked about privilege, and for me it was eye-opening, because at one point he was saying gently, you're concerned about the ecological crisis, but you don't talk about the humanitarian crisis enough. And I say, fair enough, because there's humanitarian crisis here in Canada, there's around the world, but there's in many parts of the world it's much more pronounced. And so I thought that was a beautiful way to just to help somebody expand their awareness, and to not take it as a critique, but just as a gift, and say, hey, have you seen this? Have you felt this? That's what I try to do with the podcast and the Calm Presence newsletter and whatever. But I fail a lot again because of my unconscious bias, which I'm increasingly aware of. You know what? I see them all the time. I listen to myself speak, and I go, oh my God. did you just say that? Can I edit that out? Well, you can't edit it all out, or just stop doing it. But then to just to work on it, through exercises, and what I'm discovering through the deep adaptation colleagues is that when you accept that we are where we are, because a lot of people can't, it's just they would stop living the way they are, which is actually what they need to do. But there's that whole vicious circle. But when you do accept that things are the way that they are, and it depends where you are in the world, then another type of energy comes in that's more about the longer term, that's more about adaptation, and not adaptation in the sense of, oh, well, let's just use a bit less of this or that. No, we really have to change the ways that we live, but in a way that is natural, because we naturally need housing, we naturally need heat, we naturally need food, we need companionship, we need culture, and all those things are available to us. We kind of went way overkill on the amount of things that but the basic needs are simple for humans to live on the planet. And so as I think about adaptation and longer term, I keep thinking about the arts. I had an interview with Felicia Young, who runs Earth Celebrations in New York City. But there are many such community arts projects all around the world, that aren't well known because they just do their thing in their communities. And I have a feeling that community-engaged arts are going to be really important as these crises become more complex. In the previous episode, you talked about the epistemology of coordination and the difference between crises and relations, and so it's all about reconnecting, and we use these terms left and right, but that really what it is. I love the word numb, because in my Qigong practice, that's what we try to do, is unnumb our bodies, right? Unnumb our spirits, unnumb our energy. So unnumbing, reconnecting, relating, and doing it on the long term, and doing it without panic, but with a sense of, I don't know if the word urgency is right, but anyway.
Intention, certainly. Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times now in this podcast about the kind of failures, but that just takes me to, one of the many important teachings within GTDF's work that's, about this intention to try to learn the lessons that we can learn from what is currently dying, and apply those, actually learn them so that we don't just continuously repeat these mistakes. And of course, in the process, we're going to repeat the mistakes little by little. But I think that also being open and talking about what isn't working or what traps we're falling into is so instructive. And that we can also learn a lot from listening to our friends and colleagues tell us their stories about that. And I think that it's important to do that not only within the frame of understanding colonial logics, but then also how that connects to different art practices, right? So what are the circular traps we keep falling into within arts practices that are probably rooted in kind of colonial thought and habits of mind, but that we need to learn from, right? And that's also then again, okay, so then what's the education, what's the pedagogy for trying to learn from that?
But even the term education has a bit of a up-down approach, right? And a lot of real learning is cooperative, it's shared, and there are facilitators, there are leaders, I guess, but they're not necessarily the total experts, because some of their expertise is, let's call it biased or flawed or whatever, right? Colored by certain frames of ways of thinking, and it's not that they're wrong, but they're not necessarily the truth, their only truth. And you may, as you spoke, I remembered Vanessa talking about making new mistakes. That's part of the. When we say GTDF, for those who were acronym, I said it earlier, but it's the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures. There's an article in particular called "Preparing for the End of the World as We Know It," which I always point to, and that's how part of how I adopted the theme of this year. And it's a brilliant essay about how Indigenous people don't necessarily want to save the world as it is, because it has been very bad for them.
Yep.
And it's bad, it's toxic for us as well in many ways. And yet it's also quite wonderful, right? This dichotomy, this parallel wonder and destruction. The wonder of being able to talk to you today and record it and put it on the internet, that's pretty amazing, right? And yet the footprint, the carbon footprint of the production of these things. But I think we're becoming more literate, Kim. I think we're getting there. Not just you and me, but the people around us, because you arrive at I'm thinking in French, une impasse, at a certain point you become stuck and you say, I can't live this way anymore. And then you turn around and you realize that you're not the only one, that there are people who are similarly, or either discouraged or excited, whatever. And it's getting those things connected, and mostly locally, because this is, you live here in Vancouver, I live in Ottawa. I started an art and ecology potluck in Ottawa. And if ever you're in Ottawa, you should come. Every, the second Wednesday, every second month. And the first one was just magic, because we did nothing. We just talked. We didn't set up any activist groups. No. We just had food. We talked about the we talked about cooperative housing. We talked about art. Talked about what we were passionate about, what we were worried about, all out there. So I encourage people to get to, and especially now it's a bit easier in post-COVID, to get together and talk.
I feel so inspired by that. I want to set one up here. And I feel like even that seed was planted through the beautiful work that Kendra Facconi was doing with the Only Animal, and particularly with their Artist Brigade project, which I was really privileged to be able to participate in. That project, which she may have talked about on the podcast.
She's been on twice, and you talked about it in episode 76.
Oh, okay. But, I feel like that would be the kind of easy but meaningful step to bring people together who have already assembled and more.
Yeah, bringing people together, and when I talked to David Maggs, he was talking about the transformative power of being as opposed to thinking, which is part of it as well, as when we talked about embodiment. So I'm seeing part of the work. I'm writing an essay now for a Calm Presence that's called Accept, Adapt, Respond, which is coming out of the deep adaptation language from Jem Bendel and others. But that's where I'm at. I'm not saying others necessarily need to follow my path, but I'm going to share my path, because I like the idea of responding through invitation, responding through aesthetic experiences, through crazy things that you might do, going for a sound walk with people who have never done it before, like we did in Trout Lake, and living life with much humility, because Vanessa talks about that, and really thinking about what it means to be humble, right? It doesn't mean that you stop talking, or it just means that you listen and you give space. And people say you talk to too many old white men. I said, well, fine, I'll change. I like them because they're my friends, and I'm not going to start talking to them. But you're right. I should talk to who do you suggest? And then you made a suggestion. And talk to Kelly tomorrow. So I think that's part of the dynamic. It's just listening, responding, accepting that we're in a situation that might lead to extinction. But then there's Emergence magazine. I listen to a lot because I'm retired. I have all this time.
I'm so jealous.
Well, I'm jealous of you. You're working. You're teaching young people, and I think you've got a lot going on there. That's fun. But we can exchange. But there's just an interesting thought about what do you do? What has humanity done previously in crises and real and there have been. Hey, Kim, thank you very much.
Oh, well, hey, Claude. Thank you very much.
Be careful which historians you listen to, but there's some stories there that are worth. And then how does one live through a crisis? Now, a relatively small one like a hurricane where everything is destroyed, how do you rebuild, and how do artists contribute? That I don't know very much about. Honestly, Jen Ray in Australia is doing, there's a book that just came out, and there's lots of things going on that I need to learn about, and I'm going to talk to these people. But I find that's the next frontier, is understanding how to not necessarily even survive, because to survive is whatever, we're all going to die. It's how do people live in crises? How do they adapt? What kind of solidarity comes through? And how can that knowledge be shared in ways that is not appropriating, not extractive, not anything like that? And honestly, I don't know. This is what's coming for me, is understanding those and going gently into those worlds and hearing the stories and connecting the dots.
A couple books came to mind when you were talking.
Well, that's how we end the episodes, is recommended reading. So what do you got for me, Kim?
Intuiting it. And both of them are about worlds ending, but they're also about engaging multi-species experiences. So one of them is called Flightways, Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction by Tom Van Doren, and he writes about different birds who have gone extinct or who are becoming extinct, and the kinds of narratives and cultural practices or representations that exist, not maybe practices so much, but it's certainly representations of things like the dodo bird, right? But then also birds on the edge of extinction today, and the different kinds of practices that we have around those, and the instructions then on living and dying and grieving. And then the other book that I'm obsessed with is Alexis Pauline Gumb's Undrowned, which is feminist lessons from marine mammals. And she's thinking about the crossing and the Black oceanic histories, and then she learned an incredible amount about a lot of marine mammals and really honors them. And so it's a kind of methodology that she offers in just starting to think with and learn with how these other mammals adapt, live with changing climates as well, but without the kind of, anthropocentrism that we would anticipate from other disciplinary expressions.
I'm sure there's others. There's one on your table here, I Want a Better Catastrophe by Andrew Boyd, which I didn't know about it, and I'm sure that your book's short. But are any other suggestions? Or
those are the ones I most wanted to share today.
Well, we'll end with something I've not done before, but I listen to the New York Times, the Daily, every day, and I listen to the current CBC. Not always, but I mean mostly. And at the end, they have a way of thanking their guests that always makes me emotional. They say something like, "Hey, Kim, thank you very much for that." There's just something in the voice that's very gentle, and so I always want to do that. Hey, Kim, thank you very much.
Oh, well, hey, Claude. Thank you very much.